Hello and welcome to this Scot Stories video. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Kirsten and today's story relates to two young women who you might be surprised to hear about having been here in Edinburgh back in the early 16th century. Their names were Ellen and Margaret More, and collectively they were referred to at the time as the Black Ladies. The scant records that we have in relation to Ellen and Margaret show that they probably originally came from sub-Saharan Africa, and quite possibly they were stolen from Portuguese slave ships before being gifted to King James IV of Scotland. And when they arrived in Scotland in 1504, they were only about 10 years old. So although they were referred to as the Black Ladies, they were very much young girls. And their original names we have no record of. They were given the last name More as a reference to the fact that they were black. And James in turn gave Ellen and Margaret to his daughter Lady Margaret Stuart. She was about the same age that they were, and they were to become her ladies in waiting. Lady Margaret Stuart was the daughter of King James IV and Margaret Drummond. Now, Margaret Drummond and James seem to have fallen in love fairly early on in their lives and possibly even secretly married. This theory is borne out by the rather suspicious circumstances under which Margaret Drummond died. She and her sisters died from food poisoning, which conveniently left James free to marry the woman that everybody else wanted him to. And this was another Margaret, Margaret Tudor, the sister of King Henry VIII of England, thus tying together the two royal families. James did have a number of illegitimate children by various different women, but Lady Margaret Stuart was always the most favoured, and she was given accommodation here within Edinburgh Castle to form her household. And so it was to here that Ellen and Margaret More came, and it was here that they spent most of the time that we know of them being here in Scotland. So whilst we don't know a huge amount about the lives of Margaret and Ellen More, we do know a little bit more about a particular event which took place during the time that they were both living within Edinburgh Castle. It was an event that took place in 1507 and was so successful that it was repeated again in 1508. And this was an event that at least one of them probably played a fairly significant part in. Now, for the most part, the women of the court were not to be involved in this event. They were to stay up here in Edinburgh Castle. And in fact, there was a specially designed window on the left-hand side of the palace within the castle, as we're looking at the building now, looking out to the south and down the cliffs 300 or so feet below. And this was where Margaret Tudor in particular would have stayed to watch the event take place. But we can imagine at this point, emerging from the front of the castle, a huge sedan chair being carried by 14 men, and within it was a very beautiful young woman dressed incredibly elegantly in a dress of damask with gold floral embroidery, sleeves of green and yellow taffeta, and she was to be carried down the side of the hill to go and take part in the event. So just here you can see what is today King's Stables Road. Back in the early 16th century there was what was known as a tilt ground here, so basically a jousting arena. And this was going to be the location in 1507 and again in 1508 of this huge spectacle which was known as the Tournament of the Wild Knight and the Black Lady. When the invitations went out for the event, the guests were told to gather in the Field of Memories between the Castle of Maidens and the Secret Pavilion. So if I turn the camera around here, you'll be able to see that behind me there is the Castle of Maidens, Edinburgh Castle. And the Secret Pavilion was a silk marquee that was laid out specially for the event. And travelling down from the castle in her sedan chair was the Black Lady. When she arrived, she would have been greeted by a rather extraordinary sight. The guests were all dressed in somewhat fantastical historic costume. Along with the secret pavilion, there were many other tents and props, and there were also lots of unusual animals on display. The sources, for example, mention dragons, presumably either horses dressed up or perhaps even early automatons. At one point in the proceedings, the Black Lady climbed into a chariot pulled by a unicorn, again presumably another horse dressed up, and creatures from the king's own menagerie might have been out on show too, such as the lion and the wolf that we know that James IV owned, although I'm assuming nobody attempted to get them dressed up in anything. And then the main event took place. This was to be jousting. By the early 16th century, jousting was not a form of warfare that was in any active use anymore. It was a very traditional and romanticised form of entertainment. James IV had a love of these traditional stories of the King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and traditional tales of medieval chivalry, and these were the sorts of things that he was trying to recreate. So the fight itself was entirely staged and choreographed, and from the outset everybody knew who was going to win. This was going to be the Wild Knight, played by the king himself. And his prize, I'm rather sorry to say for her, was to be a kiss and an embrace from the Black Lady. After this, the Black Lady was helped back into her sedan chair, and all of the guests travelled about a mile to what was by this point the King's Edinburgh residence at Holyrood Palace, where the celebrations would continue. So behind me here is Holyrood Palace, which would have looked quite different back in 1508, but this was where James IV and his wife Margaret Tudor had set up as their main royal household, which had been very newly built at that time. And this was where all the guests from the tournament arrived from the tilt ground. And here the celebrations continued. There was dancing, a play was performed, and at the end of it all there was a huge banquet. And as a finale to this great feast, James created a sort of magic by having clouds appear within the banqueting hall above the diners' heads, and suddenly the Black Lady herself was whisked up by some sort of harness into the clouds, and she disappeared. So this was also James trying to claim that he had control not over just the lands and the people of Scotland, but also over the weather and powers over the supernatural too. So this was the finale of the tournament of the Wild Knight and the Black Lady. We know who the Wild Knight was, but what do we know about the Black Lady? So it's possible that the Black Lady of the tournament, which was performed down below the cliffs just here, was a high-ranking white lady of the Scottish court, and the evidence put forward for that is that there was a purchase at the time of a set of black leather gloves and sleeves which could have been used to make her arms look black. However, of course, it is also perfectly possible that the part was played by Ellen More. And if that was the case, then Ellen would have been only about 13 or 14 years old at the time of the tournaments, and James would have been 34 or 35. So here she was being made to perform in this very sexualized manner by a man so much older than her, who held the balance of power in terms of both race and gender, who was, of course, her employer. And not only that, he was the king. So the balance of power was absolutely ridiculous, and there is absolutely no way that Ellen could have had any choice whatsoever in whether or not she took part in the tournament. Now, they were seen in many ways as status symbols, really. It was quite common for royal households. You see it in places like Portugal and Italy and Spain, where they had black servants. They were considered very much status symbols, very kind of unusual and something to be boasting about. And so they were given a lot of gifts of beautiful dresses and clothes, and they were presented apparently twice a year with new pairs of very luxurious shoes as well. But of course, I mean, I called them servants. technically they weren't slaves, but of course you've got to imagine these two young girls, when they arrive, they're only about 10 years old, they're far away from home, they're in a place that is so totally different from anywhere that they've known growing up in their younger years. They have, say, not arrived there by any sort of choice. When they get there, they will have been very noticeable. People would have not really seen black people. It would have been very, they would have been, I imagine, just stared at a lot, and obviously during the tournament they were seen as objects of, one of them, we think it's probably Ellen, who, if it was one of them who was the black lady in the tournament, considered an object of lust under that circumstance, but of course in other circumstances they may well have been looked at as objects of fear and suspicion. So they're there in the court, and the chances of them being able to leave and go and get other work, it's not really a choice that they would have to make. So they weren't the only black people within James's court. There were a few men as well in different roles, including one man who was a drummer, who was a musician, and he certainly was paid. We have records showing that he was paid more than people of Scottish descent who were doing similar jobs. He was looked after when he fell ill. They employed a Scottish or a doctor to come and look after him for a couple of weeks during his illness. He actually did manage to leave the court and go and seek his fortunes elsewhere, and it certainly wasn't acrimonious. When he went, he was given a sort of goodbye, thank you gift of what would have been not insubstantial amount of money of £3 at that time, and so technically, say that none of them seem to have been slaves, but in reality, for these two young girls, they didn't really have any choice in their circumstances. And when you look at it from Ellen's point of view, if she was the black lady of the tournament, it is quite distressing and quite disturbing circumstances that she must have found herself in. Ellen and Margaret stayed with Lady Margaret at Edinburgh Castle until Lady Margaret's marriage, which took place when she was all of around 17. She was married to Lord Gordon, the son of the Earl of Huntly, and she moved with him to the Highlands. James IV gave Lady Margaret and her husband the lands of Badenoch, including the castle of Ruthen, where Ruthen Barracks now stand, as their dowry in 1510, so quite possibly that is where they went. Although we can't be sure, it looks like a strong possibility that Margaret More went with them and became part of the household there. We have another document that shows a black Margaret being given the gift of a dress in 1512. Presumably this is our Margaret. However, interestingly, another document states that a Margaret Preston was gifted the same dress at the same time. Perhaps Margaret More, for better or worse, had married a Scotsman. Ellen, on the other hand, is known to have been placed within the household of Margaret Tudor, based at Linlithgow Palace. It does seem to me to be a particular cruelty to have split the girls up. At least when they were together, it could have been some comfort to each of them to have had one other person who was going through the same experience. They do seem to have been back together, however, one last time, as in 1513 a gift of money was given jointly to the More lasses. This, however, is the last that we hear of either Ellen or Margaret. And, of course, this is also the year we hear the last of James IV, as 1513 was when he fell, leading the Scottish troops against the English at the disastrous Battle of Flodden. Was Ellen perhaps with Margaret Tudor, as she looked out from the tower of Linlithgow Palace, waiting for her husband to return? Was Margaret with Lady Margaret when her first husband died and was buried in Kinloss Abbey in 1517? Did they provide comfort to their mistresses in their darker days? And did these royal white women ever consider the lives that the More lasses had had stolen from them in order for their own emotions and desires, and those of their husbands, to be attended? Margaret Tudor and Lady Margaret lived with both the privileges and restrictions of royalty, and would have also had a lack of autonomy over their own lives, especially due to their gender. However, at least they lived within a country where everyone looked similar to them, and within a culture that was familiar to them from birth. So the story of Ellen and Margaret More is one that is really quite sad and in many ways quite distressing. But I hope that you'll agree that it's also one that's very important that we do not forget. So thank you very much again for watching, and hope to see you next time.